The advanced section has 3 tabs. The bottom one is the beat grid section, which is where you set beat grids, control the tempo, and tell Traktor where the beats in a track are. This section here is the cue section, which allows you to set hot cue points. Again, very similar to the hot cues on CDJs, but more polished and I think somewhat easier to use than the ones on CDJs. And lastly, we have the move section, which lets us skip forward and back by, say, any number of beats. In this case, 4 beats. We've got it to 4, but we can move that to 2, like so, and move it backwards and forwards. So normally we set our beat jump increments here. We can also set it to loop, which means that the beat jumps will always be the same amount as whatever the loop is currently set to. Now on most controllers, which have controls or buttons set up for beat jumping, this is how it works, is you have one knob to control the current loop length, and then both loops and beat jumps follow that length. But in some cases you can actually have those configured separately as well. The beat jump section will let you do a few things. You can also use it to set loop points and various other bits and pieces, but we're not going to get into that in any detail in this lesson. I've never really seen people use it. So that's it for the advanced section for now, although we'll be going into cues in more detail in a moment. Now, hot cues are, as mentioned, something that Traktor does, and Traktor does quite a little bit better than CDJs. So when you set hot cues on a track, they are saved. So if you're using an MP3 or an AIFF, we'll actually save those hot cues into the track so that when you move the track around between computers, the hot cues will still be available inside Traktor. Just a small technical note, Traktor will support lots of different file formats, WAVs, MP3s, OGGs, AIFFs, FLACs, for various different formats. However, from experience, the only two that are well supported, like the only two that are reliable, are MP3s or AIFFs. MP3s are obviously lossy, so they're not as high quality, whereas AIFFs are basically the same as WAV, but AIFFs support metadata, so they can have the album name, the artist name, the track name, cover art, all that stuff can be embedded in the file, like with an MP3. Now, WAVs, while they sound the same as AIFFs, don't have support for the metadata, so Traktor actually has to store the data about them, the artist name and so on, inside an internal library, which means you can't transfer that data between computers easily. So if you have WAVs from Beatport or something like that, do make sure to convert them to AIFFs. That's a very easy process, just to make sure that Traktor can handle them properly. And if you are using a service like Beatport or something, if you want to use lossless, use AIFF instead of WAV, just because it's a little bit more reliable. So, cue points are pretty straightforward inside Traktor. To set a cue point, you just hit the corresponding cue point button, which you can see down here. We have 8 cue points. To delete that cue point, you hit the trash icon. It'll always delete the last or the most recently selected cue point. Once a cue point's set, you hit the cue point to go back to it, and that keeps the current playing state. So if you hold down the button, it will play from the cue point until you let go, much like on a CDJ. If you're playing and you hit the cue point button, it will go back to the cue point, but it will keep playing, so not like a CDJ cue. And if you're stopped and you hit it, it will just go straight back to the cue point. And we could delete it like so. Now again, Traktor is smart and will automatically, depending on how you've configured it, snap cue points to the beat. So we'll be talking about that in the next lesson when we talk about beat grids. There are a number of different types of cue point, although most of those are around for legacy reasons. You can have fade in and fade out points, which are kind of good for radio mixes where tracks fade in and fade out. The traditional one we just showed you is the cue point. A load marker is the same as a cue point, but if you set a load marker, when you load that track into Traktor again, like so, it will actually automatically take you to the load marker. So it's just a cue point that will automatically load. Grid points are there for legacy reasons. Old versions of Traktor actually used cue points to set the grids, but are no longer necessary. And loop points will let you have a cue point that, when configured, actually turns on a loop. Otherwise, they're much like normal cue points, but they'll automatically enable a loop for you, which could be super useful if you've got, say, a techno track and you want to loop out an 8-bar drum pattern. So you can just set a cue point, and when you hit that cue point, you'll just start looping there. Very handy for sort of progressive or minimal tech sets, that sort of thing. Now again, there are a whole bunch of different ways you can control the cue points here. We can skip between cue points like so, we can set them there, we've got this trash button, we can change all the options from the drop down. But in real life, how you use the cue points is entirely dependent on what hardware you've got plugged in. The majority of Traktor hardware just has kind of 4 or 8 buttons. You hit the button to set the cue point, you hit the button again to use it, and then you hold down shift and hit the button to delete that cue point. That's the most common configuration, but some controllers do it differently. Some controllers let you skip between cue points using the next and previous buttons. It really does just depend on the hardware you've got plugged in.